You've talked and written about, I think, what it is to cover a State Department and a Secretary of State that itself doesn't want to engage and doesn't want to do that. I think it's important to drill down and say, what's the actual harm here? President Nixon did a lot of stuff against the press. President Bush campaigned for re-election, said annoy the media, re-elect Bush. Clinton at a certain point lashed out at the media and couldn't fathom why they weren't siding with him. Every single president becomes the media critic in chief, trying to take away Brian and my job at some point. What is the actual repercussion of this for the public, for reporters, and for the understanding that we have of what the government does on our behalf?
I think it's profoundly important because it hurts the ability of Americans to understand what their government is doing. And frankly, I responded to that. I did not know that he had called me that, because I just can't keep up with everything that he calls people. But if you asked Hillary Clinton what she thinks about me,
it would not be the same.
Believe me, she thought I was a royal pain in the ass during that entire campaign.
But she had enough respect not to say so, not to try to take you down publicly the way Trump has. At least she had respect.
Well, the fact is that I was very aggressive on rope lines because from March, when the New York Times broke the story, March of 2015, when the New York Times broke the story about her private email server, and she had a bizarre press conference in the UN Security Council, which was another whole issue, 8 days later. From then until September 4th, when I sat down with her for her first interview, she had not done a press interview. Yeah. Much to the stress of her staff, because they thought she needed to get ahead of it. She needed to answer these questions. But she was so defensive about it that I said to my colleagues in the press corps, we have to get her to answer questions. So she would finish a speech, and I would be climbing over chairs and people to get past the Secret Service and to the rope line and try to shout a question, and she was very good at deflecting, and it was completely inappropriate. I've done similar things with Ronald Reagan, as Susan knows. But the fact is, if presidents are not going to hold press conferences or answer questions, or candidates for president, it's our job to try to get them to talk. And for people to understand who it is that's either the commander-in-chief or someone who's running to be commander-in-chief. And so I do think that that is our job.
Sure, so
we're not stenographers.
Right, you're definitely not a stenographer. But so you went after Clinton and ultimately, no doubt with the prodding of her staff, but you ultimately got her to sit down and address these questions about topics she desperately wanted to avoid. There was accountability there, although avoidance there for a long time as well. The thing that strikes me about some of the things I've seen you say currently is that unpack this for us to make sure that I'm clear on this, but it seemed to me that you were saying the nature of the aggressive, hostile stance from the president down affected what you've characterized as sort of a Heisman approach from former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo, who's now the Secretary of State, right?
Who has still not engaged with the media.
So talk about why that matters, because these are huge agencies these people run, and presumably you have sources deeply buried, even if they're not deep staters, deeply buried within the bureaucracy there, and that you can ferret things out. Why is it important that they, from the top, are open with what they're doing?
Well, in this case, it's particularly important because you have a president who will fire Rex Tillerson on Twitter at 8:30 and 8:40 in the morning, who will make pronouncements. That's why his tweets are important. And actually, the National Archives and the presidential documents agencies have decided that they are presidential statements. So it is something that we have to cover. But because he is so unique and so changeable, shall we say, in his statements, you can get 2, 3, 5 sources at the State Department, in the National Security Council, and they are not necessarily giving you the truth. They think they might be, but they're giving you their version of what they think the policy is. We also don't have principals and deputy committee meetings in regular ways. Policies are not decided in an orderly fashion, decisions as to whether or not the president is going to tell Kim Jong-un that he's canceling the joint exercises with South Korea. Spontaneously, without telling Secretary of Defense James Mattis, as NBC reported last week, without telling South Korea's President Moon, without telling Shinzo Abe in Japan. There are consequences to a president who is as spontaneous and ad hoc in his diplomacy. So it makes it that much harder. I am very, very careful about anything I report now because I don't know if the president is going to contradict it. And the other piece of it is that facts don't seem to matter. And that's why we're in a sort of crisis of journalism.
Do you associate that with the hostility of journalism?
I think it's just I'm not sure whether it's a psychological impediment or a deliberate impediment, but I mean, Mike McCurry, who is a very fine State Department and then White House spokesman, said that a Democrat, but someone who had studied foreign policy at the Woodrow Wilson School and who had cared about this stuff, said that the job of the press secretary is to tell the truth slowly. You know, there's spin everywhere, and we've all experienced it, but it's not to deliberately, consciously lie. It happened a couple of times under Reagan with Larry Speakes, former press secretary, deputy press secretary. But what we have reached is a level where the mendacity is epidemic from the spokespeople, or they simply don't know what the president is doing, or he changes his mind.